Hey, I'm sitting here in Madagascar. It's May 10th, 2016, with Professor MARLA BRETTSCHNEIDER, who just held some wonderful women's group with some of the women who are interested in converting to Judaism. I'd like to ask Marla, who is a professor at the University of New Hampshire and a good friend of mine, and I thank her officially for joining us in Madagascar to tell us something about her experience interviewing the women.
Thank you, Bonnie. One of the main reasons to interview the women on their own is because usually when researchers come down, they don't really pay attention to the women at all. So they're not getting any direct information about women or women's experience or women's knowledges. Often there are male leaders, and then the people who come in from the global north will only speak to the male leaders. So if you don't ask, so I'm happy to talk to anyone. The problem is, if you don't ask explicitly for time with the women, then you won't get any time and you won't hear anything from the women. So that's partly why we organized that in that way, to make sure that we at least got something, because most researchers come down and they won't hear anything from usually more than half the community. Often the communities are more than half women.
So thank you. I mean, I'm so happy
pleasure.
this worked out. So how did you work with the translations, the French and English barriers?
There was a fantastic woman that Bonnie set me up with, who speaks both Malagasy and French and then also English. She's educated, a researcher and a scholar, and so she was able to, the other women in the particular group that we met with today was interchanging between French and Malagasy, and it was great because she could do both and then work with me.
Okay, so tell us some of the highlights of your interview.
So some of what's very interesting is that they had some different narratives than a lot of the narratives that we've heard before. For example, one narrative that they all explained to me, all the people in the group in their own ways, was that they have a story that in Madagascar the people came from ancient Israel, but they came in different waves of migration over different periods of time. Some of those waves of migration have a scriptural basis in the Hebrew Bible, and they were quoting me from Hebrew Bible to show that that was described already in biblical times. They said it doesn't necessarily mean that everybody who they describe from different waves of immigration might describe themselves that way, but that's their understandings. There's a lot of emphasis on the history of the royal families here, who understands themselves as Jews or as Israelites or as having come from ancient Israel. So one of the interesting things is that they said that's a little different from some narratives that Bonnie and I have heard in other research, is that they describe that the people who generally live around Antananarivo, but that they call
you said that right.
Yeah, I'm pretty good at that. That they call the highlands have been related to the royal families, and those they say came in the migration called Beit Yehuda. And so, although often we find when Bonnie and I have talked to people that the word Jewish is a very kind of new name used around the world, or that these communities with ancient roots, or describe themselves with roots in ancient Israel, you would use the word Israelite or Hebrew. I was very interested because they kept using the word Jew. So I asked them a lot of different kinds of questions, and we talked quite extensively about the use of the word Jew, but they had, different from a lot of other communities, that really ended up describing that they used the word Jew because of their relationships with the global north. This particular group actually had a Hebrew biblical name, Beit Yehuda, and said that's why they call themselves Jews. But they distinguished that from people in some other regions in Madagascar, who they said came in a different migration, and they call themselves Beit Yisrael. And so they might have a different name, although right now they say in history so much their knowledge of their histories have been lost. So since Antananarivo is the more dominant place in the culture, they might now also call themselves Jews. But anyway, the women had this tripartite description of three major migrations from ancient Israel. with different names and the different ways that they call themselves historically and today. So that's one thing, for example, that's just very different set of knowledges than both of us who have studied extensively. We haven't really heard that set of stories before.
How terrific. And I know there's some interesting stories of the women themselves, interesting problems that you brought to my attention. I'd like to hear some of them.
So they did say, I worked with Bonnie since last fall to prepare for this trip. And so I've spent the year also just studying the situation of Madagascar on the ground.
Oh, that's good to hear.
It is. So a lot of the other scholars who are terrific, but a lot of other scholars who study groups like this don't necessarily study the circumstances for the people in these communities on the ground and the difficulties and the triumphs, and therefore a different kind of understanding of the meaning of their relationships with groups like this. Because they actually don't know everyday life circumstances of the people on the ground. So what I've been doing all year in preparation for the trip is studying as much as I can about different aspects of life, economic, of the country as a whole, the country in comparison to the region, the country in comparison to the world, situations between men and women, the difference between formal rights and informal life circumstances, etc. You get the point. So I did get to ask, for example, in the particular community that we have the people coming, this group that's coming here for these few days, they say most, they appeared to me to be relatively wealthy, but when they described themselves, they said we're not wealthy, because I'm sure wealthy here means something very different. So some appear to me to be slightly better off than the average person in Madagascar. And the general, I have to find my notes, I'm not prepared for it, but the general economic situation in Madagascar is really terrible. And then the situation for women is far worse than the situation for men. So to try to understand a little bit about what does it take for an ordinary person to get to a community gathering, who doesn't have a car, who doesn't have a lot of money, who works very many hours, who has a lot of responsibility. What does it take? This particular group meets on Sundays for special study, in particular towards conversion. What does it take to get to a weekly meeting when it could take you an hour and a half to get there? For most people, most people don't have cars. Two of the people I was with had a car in the family and they drove themselves. Most people, so that's what I mean, that to me, they appeared above the line, but they, of course, I'm sure compared to what's considered wealthy here, they're not at all wealthy. Most people don't have cars, so they would have to rely on walking and public transportation, getting lifts part way. So even if they don't live very far and they still live in the city, for most people it could take them at least an hour to get to a meeting that's right here in town. They said probably amongst the poorer ones, they might take an hour and a half. That's each way to get to any one meeting. So
I always say that their dedication to Mesirat Nefesh, to do this Jewish thing, is so huge and enormous that it makes all of us New Yorkers
who complain all the time.
Pale
exactly.
Compared to the kinds of levels they go to get access to Jewish information.
So exactly. So I tried to, again, I might have, I didn't have any agenda with this. I want to really understand the way that they understand this themselves. So I asked questions like, why would someone spend an hour and a half each way to get to one meeting every week or more than that for celebrations when someone else, they said because it's important. So I said, well, someone else could say they could work for an hour and earn an extra $1, or they have to tend to a sick aunt, or they have some other work to do or something that they need to do. And generally, again, this was only one small group, but I'm sure we'll hear this more from other groups, is that what they're doing is just so important, and what they're doing lifts their spirits and makes everything else livable. And so the fine line between...
How might that happen to all of us, that we all feel that way?
Exactly. So the fine line actually for me, which I look forward to exploring more, is the fine line between Marx's understanding of religion as the opiate of the people. People usually misunderstand that. What a lot of scholars would say, it's not that it takes them away necessarily from being able to change their circumstances, but it's a way to be able to tolerate the circumstances and get on with it instead of caving and collapsing. So a lot of people would understand that as Marx's understanding. So what I'm really trying to understand is what does this exploration and this relationship to these Jewish communities that they've specifically chosen, because we could talk more. There are so many communities like this. This group is affiliated with one particular community for very specific reasons, and it's very difficult. So a lot of what they say is that it helps them, it elevates their spirit. They spoke very much in terms of religious and spiritual terms. It elevates their spirit to the point where it didn't matter if they didn't earn the other dollar, or even if they did, this is such more important work and ways to spend their time that it enables everything in the rest of their life.
To have meaning.
To have meaning.
Right.
They're searching. They use the word
for meaning.
In English, the translator used the word search many times.
Okay. That's just gave me the goosebumps to listen to. Yes. I mean, that's the best view of what religion does for people.
Right.
And that's the highest and most holiest spirit in people, that we have the ability to experience spiritual and elevating things that give highlight and glimmer and gleam to the things that we do in life.
And one thing we should understand specifically about the women, which Bonnie and I have found in other communities, and it's definitely true to different degrees here as well, is that, and that a lot of other scholars and people who come here aren't paying attention. If you don't pay attention to the circumstances on the ground, you're not going to understand, as much as we have just discussed, the level of commitment that it takes for these people. So how important it is for the people who make these decisions to make these commitments. For the women, it's somehow exponentially more difficult, and therefore they work so much harder and more meaningful.
To do it. Thank you. So we have another 3 minutes, but I would like to go into the specific little cases that we had about
those differences of women.
Okay, don't tell about the differences.
Or you want
Go do the differences.
And we can do more, but for example, as is somewhat the case in other places, and they say is more the cases in rural Madagascar, but can be true also in the city here, in Antananarivo, is if, for example, if a man would like to explore things Jewish and his wife doesn't want to, he might face some risks, but mostly he would just tell his wife that he's doing it, or the wife would leave him alone. Because of the actual legal differences, legal rights between men and women, but also the unofficial differences which far surpass the actual legal situation, women are at far more risk. And if a man decides to leave a wife or accuse the wife of anything, even regardless of even if there are some egalitarian laws on the books that are relatively recent, the social circumstance is very different. So when a woman decides to move into this search, this journey to become Jewish, she's at much more risk in relation to her husband. And if her husband doesn't agree with it, he can easily divorce her, he can block her access to her children, he can cut off all funds and take all her belongings. And so although these women were saying, so I had studied this to a great extent before I came, and I had studied this in the other Jewish communities that Bonnie and I had visited. But these women described something similar, that it's much harder for women. Women put far more at risk to go on this journey and to undertake this search.
Do you know of any ones that went without their husband, or any of your group there brought their husband along, or doing it independently?
Well, yeah, I'm in the middle of I want to find out more. I've heard that there are some women here without their husbands. One woman waited, her husband died, and then she did this.
Oh, wow.
Another woman is here.
Liberating factor in many cases,
right.
yeah.
Another woman, her husband is reluctant, but he hasn't been blocking her, but it's being a little bit of attention, and I didn't get all the information on everybody else. But the little group that I was with just today, and I'll hopefully be meeting with women for the next few days, is there's really a span of life circumstances, and they all understood. When I started to, I don't just ask a question. Statistics say blah, 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 blah. I try and have them talk and bring it out. And at first they're all like, oh no, it's fine for women. But then when I ask a little bit of the questions, all of the people in my group eventually talked about the incredible risk compared to the men.
Wow. Thank you, thank you.
And we wouldn't know that if we didn't speak to the women.
Okay, thank you. Thank you,
Bonnie.
But the two little things that I would like to add
please.
were those little conversations that when I was in the room about the one whose husband couldn't come on Sundays to the classes, but they've been practicing Judaism. I thought you said for 19 years.
Yeah.
And go tell us the rest of that.
So there was a daughter who's probably in her 30s or 40s, and a mother who was in the group. And the mother had been a Christian pastor, but she was raised. Her father told her her grandfather didn't identify as a Jew because he lived under colonialism. And another time we could talk about. They said extraordinary things about how colonialism used Christianity as a weapon. And most of our experiences, Northern academics talk a little bit about that experience, but for the most part on the ground, the people that we've met on the ground reject this. This group of women talked absolutely outright about the relationship between Christianity and colonialism and the problem for Jews. And so then this woman's father, the grandfather wasn't Jewish because he lived here under colonialism. She said there was a little bit of let up of the pressure of Christian missionaries by her father's time. So he couldn't practice, but he told them stories and said, I want you to keep this alive.
Oh my God.
So then she was trained as a Christian pastor, but then then she had her children, and the woman that we were with was her firstborn. And the firstborn, so this woman, when she had her first child, the first child died. Then she was pregnant again. And it was something, I can only say somewhat vague. It was 19 years ago when she was pregnant with her second child, that's when they all decided to become Jewish. So they had an idea of themselves as Jewish, but the mother had been practicing Christian. The grandmother. When the mother was pregnant with her second child, this was too much. And they believe in miracles. And they believe that the God of it, the Jewish God, that part of being Jewish is to live by the way of miracles. So there was a lot of talk of what being Jewish means, has a lot to do with the dream life and a lot to do with living by the way of miracles. So their understanding is it's wonderful, but that would take a whole other conversation. So they all needed to pray for a miracle that the second child would be born. So they all became Jewish and they all started praying and learning. And so 19 years ago was when the family, although they understood their history as Jewish, the whole extended family became Jewish in order to hopefully that the baby would be born alive. And it was. And since the baby was born alive, then they kept doing that.
Okay, so let me give you the postscript to this. So she asked, if my husband does not attend the classes and is not known to the community, but we've been practicing for 19 years, can he get converted with my children and have a Jewish marriage? And I said, no problem.
Right,
we
so
will
they were
try to
told,
work
right.
this out for you.
They were told by others. So the husband has a certain kind of pride, of course, and a fear. And although the husband's been practicing in the home, he hasn't been able to do the formal learning for conversion that many of the other people that Bonnie's helped organize do formal learning for conversion. So he hasn't been able to do that. But unlike examples that I mentioned before, he's been actively involved with the family in a Jewish life at home. They do Shabbat, they say, they do Havdalah, things like that. And so he's been afraid that he would somehow be shamed. And not be able to answer the questions
we'll try to
of
work that
the
one
Beit
out,
Din,
yeah.
but then, and they also wanted a Jewish wedding. They're married in Madagascar already by civil law. They wanted a Jewish wedding, and people told them that they couldn't do that. And so we brought in Bonnie, because it seemed to me there had to be a way around that.
Yes.
So we brought in Bonnie, because of course Bonnie can figure out ways to make beautiful things happen, and Bonnie will work on that issue.
Oh, Marla Brett-Schneider, thank you so much. This was wonderful. And okay, Tis Kela Mitzvot.
There you go.
Many more mitzvot in your life. Thanks. Bye.